Good evening, listeners, old and new alike, and welcome back to the Man Cave, where we're going to continue our journey, our little quest, as we look for the wisdom of the ancients to guide us in masculinity, manliness, and perhaps even today a little bit as to how femininity ought to be expressed. So we're going to be carrying on in our little journey through Judges, part of the Old Testament scriptures of the Bible, or the Torah. And we're going to be looking at the next judge in the sequence. So we've already covered a little bit of ground here. We started this series looking at some of the warriors of King David from a later period and deriving the lesson there that a man needs a king, someone to serve. And from there we went on to look at Othniel, the first of the judges. And from him we saw this perfect kind of war leader hero. And he was exactly the type of person that you would want to see leading your country, and certainly in a time of war or conflict, somebody you could look up to. And what's interesting about that as we looked at it was that the account didn't focus so much on his own worthiness, but more on his ability to do the right thing and to actually love his wife and respect her. And then last time we looked at Ehud, who was this non-warrior, a guy who was, because of being left-handed, not able to fit into the battle lines, and also in a time when his own people were sending him to give tribute, he sort of bucked the trend. He did the right thing even when everybody else was unprepared for it, and he found a way to do the right thing even in spite of his own weakness and the limitations that were on him by nature. This week, we're going to be looking at a totally different story in a sense, because the judge of Israel that followed Ehud and then Shamgar was a woman named Deborah. And I'll just tell you the story, I guess, for starters, which is after Ehud died. So, following Ehud's liberation of Israel from the overthrower or the oppressor of his own day, it says that there was 80 years of peace. And then after that 80 years of peace, again, people did what was right in their own eyes. They lived for themselves, they became weak and decadent, and then this king showed up named King Jabin of the Canaanites, and he took over the lowlands with all of his chariots. He had the superior professional army, and the Israelites really had nothing to fight him with, and they obviously weren't prepared for war, and they were stuck in the hill country, hiding out on tops of the hills. And if that seems kind of irrational to you, I can say from having been there, the reason they went up on top of the hills is you really couldn't assault those with the type of weaponry that they had in the day. And even today, like as a former infantry officer, I looked at that and thought, there is no way I would want to assault up that terrible slope. Like you're talking a 45-degree grade or greater for like 400 to 500 meters, just not tenable. But you have the people of Israel hiding out from the oppressing king and his chariots in the lowlands. They're stuck on the hilltops. Obviously, they're barely able to provide for themselves in terms of sustenance, overgrazing the limited land that they have where his armies can't get to, and everything's bad again. And then it says that God gave them a judge in the person of the woman Deborah. And Deborah, she judges a bit differently from the other judges. It says she sits under a tree and all the people bring their disputes to her, and then she judges according to God's wisdom what is supposed to happen. And so that's a little bit different in and of itself, and we'll explore that a little bit later. But then you have this guy named Barak, and he shows up and he comes to Deborah, and she says to him, Barak, didn't God tell you to take 10,000 men and go and defeat King Jabin and his general Sisera, and that he would give victory into your hands? And so, like, if we'd been following the story this far, you'd kind of expect that Barak would be like, okay, well, I'm going to go do that because we're being presented with the heroes who liberate Israel. But he doesn't say that. Instead, he says, I'll go and do that, but only if you come with me. And Deborah says something to him then which is kind of interesting and really kind of central to what we're going to be exploring today. And she says, okay, I will gladly come with you, but understand that in doing this you will lose all the honor, and God's going to give Sisera's head into the hands of a woman. Barak says, that's fine with me. And so they go, he gathers the 10,000 men, and Deborah then is recorded as giving the order essentially to advance and attack. And then the people go out, being led in the battle by Barak, and they defeat the armies of Sisera, the general of King Jabin. And then Sisera escapes on foot, and he runs until he comes to a tent where there is a member of the Kenite tribe who has made peace and alliance with his king, Jabin. And so he comes to the tent and he says, okay, I need to hide. I need to be basically hidden from those who are pursuing me. Here's an ally. They'll hide me. And he comes up to the tent, and there's this woman, Jael, who is the wife of this Kenite man, and she invites him in. He says, hide me so that the pursuers can't come, and if they come here, tell them that I've gone on. She says, oh yeah, by all means. She puts him under a blanket, and then he says, I'm so thirsty. Give me something to drink. I need water. And she unstoppers a jug of milk, and she gives him milk to drink. And then it says he falls asleep from exhaustion after she covers him again with the blankets, and he's there hiding in the heat, just drank a bunch of milk, passes out. And then it says that Jael takes a stake for the tent and a hammer, and she creeps up to him silently. She places the stake above his temple, and then she drives it through his temple until it is into the ground on the other side of his skull. And then there's a big song that Barak and Deborah do, in which they celebrate that God has been merciful to give them the victory, and that Jael is most blessed of women for having slain the evil king that had oppressed the Israelite people. Right. All right, so here's the thing. Deborah and Jael are the heroes of this story. These are two women who have exercised their obligations to God in a very womanly way. You have Deborah, and what I'm about to say is going to be totally politically incorrect, by the way. But Deborah, who is given the wisdom to judge Israel, she chooses to honor the men around her by not going out and being a leader in the style of a man. She doesn't go out and tell people what to do. She sits under a tree and she lets the people come to her. She doesn't presume to go into the men's houses and tell them how they ought to live. She sits under the tree and she lets the men come to her, and then she gives the wisdom to them of God's judgment. Jael is not this modern superhero woman that's flying around kicking people off their horses and, like Mulan in the modern live adaptation of the Disney movie, where she can basically immediately kill 50 male soldiers in combat because she has chi powers. Jael is a woman. This guy Sisera is a big dude and he's a warrior. She's not going to try and overpower him. That doesn't work, right? Now in modernity, yeah, sure, we have firearms and perhaps a woman could just shoot a guy, but realistically, Jael did what she knew she had to do in order to overcome this enemy, which was she tricked him. She convinced him that she was harmless, and she lulled him into sleep, and then she crept up on him, charging into battle, but she snuck up on him so that he wouldn't wake, and then she decisively put an end to him in a pretty gruesome way. And you have these two women that are choosing to win through womanliness, through femininity. Now, there's something interesting about that. So, I spent 20 years working in the Canadian Armed Forces as an officer, and I have seen a lot of female soldiers in the Canadian Armed Forces. It's pretty normal. And we'll leave aside the whole debates that some might want to have about whether or not women should even be soldiers, and whether or not that in and of itself is a failing of manliness, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But what I will say is this, that the women who I saw that led well, and there were some, were the women who didn't try and be men. The women who expressed their feminine nature unapologetically and used their feminine nature and basically behaved in the way that they were naturally comfortable, succeeded even as combat leaders sometimes, right? And in some cases, far better than many of the men that they worked besides. In fact, there are a few that are, I think, noteworthy for being outstanding combat leaders above and beyond the vast majority of their male peers that I could think of and tell you about. And those officers were themselves. They didn't try to be someone else, and they didn't try to act like a man. They tried to act like women who they were. It's one of the fundamental principles of leadership, in fact, that there is no one leadership style. What you need to do is to express who you are properly and decisively. So there is a principle here for women. The Bible doesn't actually say that women should stay at home barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen. If you get into Proverbs 31, now I'll go ahead and say I think the Bible would imply that women should not be engaged in combat. Contextually, it wasn't even a question, though, because a woman wielding a sword is it's just not realistic that a woman could stand in a battle line besides male warriors. Maybe in a desperate last-ditch defense, but it's simply not physically realistic because there are biological differences, and that's why we have male and female sports, and in spite of transgenderism's confusion of that whole thing. So it wasn't an issue then, but there's probably a whole different discussion to be had about that whole thing. Men are naturally more aggressive. Men are naturally the defenders, and women are, in the main, naturally the nurturers. And that's part of design. It's part of our biological makeup. But women are not told in Scripture that you must stay home barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen. In fact, if you look at the ideal wife, it's described in Proverbs 31. The ideal wife is the manager of the household. She's the buyer and seller. She's in the marketplaces doing business transactions. She is the one who manages the finances. She's also, in the context, because it's a rich house that's being described, the house of a king, in fact, that woman is giving direction to the servants, and she's overseeing and giving management to the household so that the man, in this particular context being described, can go and do his business of being a politician or a governor and making decisions at law. A woman is not told she can't exercise authority over others in the secular sphere of business, or manage accounts, or conduct business, or be in a career, but she's to be focused on her family, and that is, according to scriptures or the Old Testament and the New Testament, kind of the natural design is that a woman should be nurturing her children. Biologically, it was a necessity, obviously, for most of history, and yet she could conduct business and manage and lead that business outside of the household in support of that goal. So there's nothing saying a woman can't have a job, and there's nothing saying a woman is somehow less than a man or less capable than a man in these things. But if you look at, and there are many, by the way, the women heroines in Scripture, they all achieve their great victories by being womanly. You have Ruth, who is the caregiver of her mother-in-law after she's widowed, and she wins a place of honor in the household of Boaz as his wife, and becomes essentially a noblewoman because of her faithfulness to her mother and her faithful hard work and labor to provide for a household when her husband is dead. And by her subtle feminine wiles in catching the heart of Boaz. And you have Esther, the queen, who is married to the king of Persia, and in that particular situation she manages to, through careful and very political maneuvered efforts, she manages to bring about the salvation of the whole nation of Israel by the way that she steers the king, using her beauty and her love for the king and even her sexuality to achieve the things that no man could have possibly achieved in that situation. And there you have that kind of principle that you see in Deborah, is that she doesn't try and be a man. She doesn't try and go and stand over the men and say, God made me the judge, this is what you're going to do, I'm telling you right now. Instead, she actually tries to empower the men in her life and around her. She tries to inspire them to rise up and take responsibility for themselves. But here you have the picture of a society that is basically on the brink of starting into serious decline because the men are not taking ownership of their responsibility, and they're leaving the decision-making to their women and all the hard choices to their women. Deborah is being essentially forced, not in her judgment, which is a position God appointed her for, and arguably as a judgment against the men, but that's neither here nor there. Barak is demanding that she come with him and that she basically become the leader of the war expedition because he doesn't want to take responsibility for it. And because he does that, God takes the honor away from him and gives it to a humble housewife, essentially, who kills the king by sneaking up on him, deception, and driving a stake through his head. So the principle at work here for us is that we as men need to see how wrong it is for us to be falling into that feminist trap, because we're all influenced by feminism. It is a part of our cultural makeup. And this egalitarianism, which I'm not talking in any way about the idea of equal worth for men and women, because men are clearly not better than women in the eyes of God. God created man, male and female, he created them. Both the masculine and the feminine are aspects of God, expressed in the image of God in them. And there is neither male nor female in Christ. Both are equal before God. that's not at all questioning, I'm not at all questioning the equal worth of men and women when I challenge this. What I am saying is that men and women are not the same, and men have been given the greater strength biologically. They have been given the nature of aggression and defense. They have also been given the task of leadership. And so you look at the picture of marriage in Christian scriptures, and what does it say? Wives, submit to your husbands as unto the Lord. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church, sacrificing himself for her to lift her up holy and blameless in the eyes of God. We are, as men, called to lead sacrificially. That we're called to be those who make the hard decisions, not without our wife's counsel or contrary to their best interests, but in counsel with our wives. We are supposed to protect them and choose what is in their best interests, and we're supposed to lead. And, the picture of a man who actually puts his family's interests first and his wife's interests first in everything that he does is not a man that many women would actually have an issue following. And, you might think, who is this guy to even start talking about submission and leadership and blah, blah, blah? Well, I am a man who has submitted to others all my life. In fact, most of us do that, even if we don't recognize it. But in a very tangible way, I always was in submission to my own authorities above me, whether male or female. And I have served female officers, by the way. And I submit to those in authority over me. It's that simple. When you submit to the authority who is abusive, it's not fun. I get that. But when you submit to somebody whose greatest interest is your own welfare and doing the right thing at all times, it's actually really nice. It's quite wonderful. You don't have to worry that you're being looked after. You can trust that person to look after your best interests. And you might challenge them with information that you think they don't know, but you're not actually concerned that any decision they would make is contrary to what is good. Deborah is in this story trying to get Barak to be that kind of leader. She's trying to challenge him to step outside of his effeminate behavior and start taking ownership for his role as a war leader in Israel. Instead, he says, no, I'm not doing that. I'm going to take you, and if you go, then I'll go. If you give the order, then I'll attack. We need, as men, to own this principle. Don't make the women in your life make the hard decisions. That is wrong. You need to step up, own responsibility for yourself and those in your care, and make the right decisions in counsel, in respect, but you need to be decisive and make decisions. There is truly nothing more selfish, as it seems selfless, than the man who makes his wife make the decision. If your wife is asking you, it's fine to ask her opinion. I'm not saying don't ask her opinion. What I'm saying is, oh, which house should we buy? Well, what do you think? I don't know. What do you think? Are you going to put all of the responsibility on your wife? Or are you going to man up? And are you going to go out and look at the situation, think about it, decide what you think is best, present COAs, courses of action, like, here are the 3 houses that I think are good. This is what I think is good about this one, this is what I think is good about this one, and this is what I think about this one. Well, here's the one that I recommend. What are your thoughts? Well, I don't like that, or I don't like this. That one I do really like. Okay, well, we can go with that one. I think that works. As opposed to just leaving the field wide open and forcing someone else to make the hard decision whenever you're confronted with a situation that doesn't have a simple answer. It's cowardice. Like, you're not actually respecting her by bringing her into the decision making. You're putting all of the responsibility on her. Like, let's be honest, nobody likes to make hard decisions, because then if the consequences come out to be bad, you own all the responsibility for that decision. Instead, it's really easy to just pass it off and put it on someone else's shoulders so that you can't be blamed if it goes wrong. And that's honestly what we're really doing. We're not being egalitarian. We're being cowards and selfish, and we're not taking responsibility for ourselves. So, obviously, I'm not saying that you need to overrule and tyrannically tell your wife or any other woman what to do. I'm saying you need to lead sacrificially and take ownership and start making decisions that are in the best interests of the other, so that they can respond to your decisions and perhaps give productive criticism and other wisdom that you can then adapt your decision with. This is all basic decision-making 101 in terms of military leadership. You know, I've talked about this in another video in which I was answering a Q&A, but the officer in a platoon or a company makes the final decision. He doesn't do it without consulting his 2IC from the senior NCOs, and he ignores their wisdom at his peril, but ultimately he takes responsibility for the final decision. A man does not make his woman make the decisions and put that burden on her and that responsibility so that he cannot own the consequences if it doesn't go the way that he expects. That's really what we're looking at here. The decline of masculinity in Israel being depicted in Judges is a picture-perfect description of where we're at. You know, you go from the warrior, perhaps our greatest generation, World War II grandfathers, who risked everything to do the right thing and was led by a moral ethic that he chose to take responsibility, and he respected his wife and integrated her into his service. And then you go to the, you know, kind of trying to make it happen, but by whatever means that they can in our father's generation, if they were at least walking the way that they should have. And then you get to the place where we're at, which is like, no dude wants to take responsibility for anything because it costs too much. How many men have I seen sending their wives out to work, even when they want to stay home with their children and raise them, not because the food is not going to get on the table on their own salary, but because they want a nice bike and a new computer and a new Xbox, and they don't have enough money for that. So get out the door, hun. Go get a cashier job, or go get a nursing degree or something, or go get yourself a job in the Army in this community here, because we don't have all the luxuries we want. I don't care if you want to stay home. We don't have enough money for all the goodies that I want. That's not sacrificially making decisions in the best interests of your wife. Oh, well, you might say she needs to be liberated. Well, then liberate her and let her do what she actually wants and is best for her. Should a woman perhaps get a job when she has children at home? Maybe. If her children are in school and cared for by others all day long, then by all means go and take employment and perhaps even have a career. That's good. But if you are making her do something that she inherently doesn't want to do, or that is not good for her and is not good for your family, simply for your own prosperity and banal desires, that's wrong. If you're not taking responsibility for any of the decisions you make because of equality, that's wrong. You're just putting all the weight on your wife, and like a coward, you're not taking responsibility. By the way, if you aren't taking ownership of the woman that you are sleeping with and offering to be her husband and to take total responsibility for her care and welfare, and you're taking the pleasure of her sexual offerings without taking responsibility for her welfare, you are a coward who is not doing what is in the best interests of the woman in your life. If you get her pregnant, she's the one who has to then carry that child or choose to kill it, and all of the consequences that might come along with that, which, by the way, are significant psychologically. You can look that up. And you're saying, but I don't have any responsibility in this situation for you. Because, I'm a modern man, and I don't tell women what to do. Yeah, no, dude, you're not supposed to be an oppressive tyrant. You're supposed to take responsibility for her and make her feel safe and make her feel like she knows that you will be there for her no matter what, and that every decision that you make is going to try at least to be in her best interest. Be her protector. That's the call. That's what you're being asked to do. When we lose that, we lose the family, and we lose our own self-respect, and we lose society at that point. Own it. Own what it is to be a man. It means to be the person who takes all the risks so that other people don't have to. And that is especially true in your own personal relationships, inside your family, and inside those who ought to be your family if you're being too craven to actually take ownership for them and own their care and protection. And frankly, if they say no, because they're not interested in that commitment, then go and find someone that you actually can share your life with and be integrated with and become one flesh with, instead of playing at it like a child. You should be embarrassed of yourself, honestly. How many men do I talk to in the course of a week online and various other places that are like, well, come on, dude, don't be stupid. Get married. You got to try it out for a couple of years and such. No, that's being a child. You are being a child, and you are trying to have the pleasure without the cost and the consequences of protecting the person who you are putting at risk. Man up, take responsibility, accept responsibility, and do not put all of the burden upon your wife or that person who you ought to be protecting as a wife. That's the lesson for today. I look forward to hearing whatever comments might come out of this little chat. And cheers and good night or good morning or afternoon whenever you happen to get this.